Welcome back to our final lecture on the book of Jeremiah. Remember from our exposition of the opening chapters, Jeremiah recounts his own commission, assured of God's presence, preparation, and purpose, with a promise of God's protection. The prophet then confronts Israel's sin. They had forgotten and forsaken God. He repeatedly calls the faithless nation to return to him, to acknowledge their guilt and abandon their unfaithful ways. In the final verse of this section, Adonai says, "Circumcise yourselves and remove the foreskin of your hearts." We touched on this command briefly, but now we return to the question of whether God's people are capable of obeying his command. First, we must note that this command is not unique to Jeremiah's generation. Earlier, Isaiah urged Judah, "Make yourselves clean." Later, Ezekiel will charge the exiles, "Make yourselves a new heart and a new spirit." And as with many things in the prophets, these commands are drawing on God's covenant. Moses had urged the people with the same command in Deuteronomy 10. But how can God give a command that his people are not capable to carry out? As with Moses, Isaiah, and Ezekiel, Jeremiah not only addresses the nation's broken covenant with God, with warnings of a coming captivity, but he also gives a promise of future restoration, including the necessity of a new heart. In Jeremiah 30-33, the prophet reveals a new covenant. In the future, Israel and Judah will be released from exile, returned to their homeland, and reunited into one nation. God will return their fortunes. He will reverse their plight, rebuild and repopulate their city, restore their joy, and reestablish their relationship with him. But this is a new covenant. God's law will now be forged on man's heart, and his guilt will be forgiven as surely as the sun rises. Man cannot change his own heart, but God can. As Moses says in Deuteronomy 30, God will circumcise their heart. Ezekiel says it this way, he will give them a new heart and a new spirit. He'll remove their heart of stone and give them a heart of flesh. And Jeremiah says, God will put his law within them and write it on their heart. In chapter 32, Jeremiah continues his dialogue with God. In the first chapter, when he responds to God's call with anxiety and uncertainty, God reassures him with the promise of his presence and preparation. In chapter 12, when Jeremiah cries out for immediate retribution on the wicked, God offers the prophet a little reality therapy, showing him that things will get worse before getting better. In chapter 15, when Jeremiah questions God's reliability, he is immediately rebuked. God calls for his repentance. In chapter 20, when the prophet accuses God of deceiving him, God is remarkably silent. Here in chapter 32, Jeremiah, who is in prison, is told by God to purchase land from a relative during the Babylonian siege. He obeys and instructs his scribe Baruch to store up the deed. But then he prays, "Why? Why is God having me to do this when disaster is upon us?" From God's answer, it appears Jeremiah doubts the promise of God's future restoration. God reminds Jeremiah of his plan, saying, "Is anything too hard for me?" God will bring retribution for the nation's sin, but also restoration to reverse their plight. He concludes by restating his plan to raise up a new leader, a righteous branch, to fulfill his covenant with David and Abraham. In chapters 34-52, Jeremiah shifts his focus to the captivity, the unfaithfulness of Judah, and the unleashing of God's wrath on his people and enemies. Chapters 34-36 form a study of contrast between the unfaithfulness of Judah's kings and the faithfulness of the Rechabites. As Babylon was besieging Zion, Zedekiah repents and releases the Hebrew slaves, which was in violation of Mosaic law. Zedekiah should not have enslaved his Hebrew brothers. But when the Babylonians withdraw, Zedekiah breaks his oath, and God responds in kind, saying, "Because you will not release the captives, I will release the covenant curses upon you." In contrast, the Rechabites obeyed their forefather, abstaining from wine and maintaining a nomadic lifestyle, and they were blessed. Judah constantly disobeyed, so disaster was coming. But covenant unfaithfulness was not unique to Zedekiah. When Jeremiah's message was read, 3 times in fact, once to the people, once to the officials, and once to the king. The royal officials were afraid. But King Jehoiakim is not afraid. Rather than tearing his garments, he tears the scroll and tosses it into a fire. Baruch is commanded to rewrite the scroll, with God confirming his coming judgment on the entire nation. The second section, chapters 37 to 45 and 52 as well, describes the sacking of Jerusalem. Throughout his reign, Zedekiah is often warned of the coming ruin. At least 3 times are recounted here. First, as the Babylonians are closing in on Jerusalem, Zedekiah recalls God's deliverance of Hezekiah, as we discuss in Isaiah 36 and 37, and he asks for God to intervene again. Yet God confirms Zion's capture and Babylon's burning of the city. Second, after Jeremiah is bound in prison, Zedekiah inquires and the prophet again confirms Zion's fall. And third, after Jeremiah is saved from an abandoned cistern by a foreigner nonetheless, Zedekiah inquires again. The prophet offers 2 options: go and live, or stay and die. If the people surrender, their lives would be spared, but if they stay and fight, they will certainly die. After a 1.5-year siege of Jerusalem by Babylon, Zedekiah fled from the city out of desperation and was captured. As promised by God, he was brought before the Babylonian king, and his life was spared. But ironically, his fate was to watch his sons be killed before him, and his eyes gouged out immediately thereafter. The temple is burned, and the city walls are broken down. In chapters 39 and 40, Jeremiah is spared and set free. But when the Babylonian installed governor, Gedaliah, is assassinated, and God directs his people to stay in the land, the remnant accuses Jeremiah of deception, taking him with them against his will to live the remainder of his life in Egypt. For their defiance of God's command and his covenant, continuing to worship idols in Egypt, God promises annihilation. Judah's ruin brings great loss, even to God. The final section of the book, chapters 46 to 51, may seem disjointed and disconnected from the prophet's other oracles. But remember that God commissioned Jeremiah as a prophet to the nations. Here he issues a message of judgment to the surrounding nations: Egypt, Philistia, Moab, Ammon, Edom, Syria, Elam, Babylon. God rebukes their pride. But for a few, surprisingly, he also foretells restoration. In the end, Israel's Redeemer will repay Babylon's pride with utter ruin, like Sodom and Gomorrah, and he will restore Israel's fortune and renew his covenant relationship with them. In sum, Judah had broken God's covenant, and thus his judgment was coming. After their sin was paid, God promised to reverse the judgment, restore their fortune, and change their hearts. Despite repeated warnings, Judah continues to reject God's command. Zedekiah refuses to surrender, and the exiles refuse to remain in Judah. Thus Zion is burned by Babylon, and the exiles fleeing to Egypt will perish there. But God promises judgment against their enemies as well. In the end, the book concludes with a note of hope, as Judah's king is released from prison. Does this signal the return of the Davidic line and the restoration of God's rule? We will wait to talk about this in the book of Ezekiel and Daniel and the post-exilic prophets.